The video uses AI voice images combined with manual editing. All content is fictional and for entertainment purposes only. Wishing you a relaxing listening experience, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any stories. The rain in Chicago didn't just fall. It drove itself into the concrete like silver nails, slicking the neon-lit streets and washing the grime into the gutters. It was the kind of night that made honest people hurry home and dishonest people seek out the shadows. Vittorio Gallo, head of the Gallo Syndicate, belonged to neither category. He owned the shadows, and tonight he was standing in one, bleeding. Vittorio wasn't supposed to be alone. He had men, loyal men, fierce men, but a sudden chaotic ambush outside a warehouse in the West Loop had scattered them. The betrayal was sudden. A sting from a rival faction he thought he had crushed months ago. A bullet had grazed his side, not fatal, but messy enough to stain his custom charcoal suit a dark, wet crimson. He needed a place to regroup, to think, and to wait for his second-in-command, Matteo, to locate him. He couldn't go to a hospital. A boss of his stature arriving with a gunshot wound would invite questions, police, and worst of all, weakness. He moved through an alley off Madison Street, his steps heavy but controlled. His sharp, angular face, usually set in an expression of terrifying calm, was tight with pain. Vittorio Gallo was a man of cold calculation, a strategist who ruled an empire built on fear and respect. He was 36, unmarried, and profoundly isolated. Power had stripped him of the luxury of trust. He saw everyone as a potential asset or a potential threat. Right now, he was a threat to himself if he didn't find cover. The alley let out onto a quieter street, lined with closed storefronts. Only one place was open, a diner called the Midnight Owl. Its neon sign buzzed, casting a garish pink hue over the wet pavement. It wasn't the sort of establishment Vittorio would ever frequent, but necessity dictated otherwise. He adjusted his dark overcoat, ensuring it concealed the bloodstain, and pushed through the glass door. A bell jingled softly, announcing his arrival. The diner was nearly empty. A solitary trucker sat in a booth, nursing a coffee, and a teenage boy dozed at a corner table. The air smelled of stale grease and burnt coffee. It was quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator. Behind the counter stood Aurora Laurent. She wasn't what anyone would call conventionally glamorous. She was a woman of substantial build, with a soft, round face, expressive brown eyes, and dark hair pulled back into a messy bun that seemed constantly on the verge of falling apart. Her uniform was slightly faded, a testament to long hours and hard work. But Aurora possessed something rare, an acute, empathetic observation. She saw things people tried to hide. When Vittorio walked in, he tried to project an aura of casual indifference, but Aurora noticed the slight drag of his left leg and the tight clench of his jaw. She saw the pale sheen of sweat on his forehead, despite the chill outside. And she saw the unnatural bulk beneath his coat, right where a man might press his hand if he were injured. He chose a booth in the farthest, darkest corner, sliding into the vinyl seat with a barely perceptible wince. He didn't look at a menu. He just stared at the rain streaking down the window pane, waiting. Aurora grabbed a pot of coffee and a mug, walking over to his table. She didn't approach him with the usual, forced cheerfulness of a late-night waitress. She approached him with the quiet caution of someone who recognizes danger. Yet she didn't turn away. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice calm and steady. Vittorio didn't look up. "Black," he replied curtly, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that commanded silence. She poured the coffee, the steam rising between them. She lingered for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. Her eyes flicked from his face down to his side, where his hand rested slightly awkwardly against his coat. Most people would have walked away, pretending they hadn't seen anything. It was safer that way. Chicago was full of men who didn't want to be noticed. But Aurora, perhaps driven by exhaustion, perhaps by an innate inability to ignore suffering, spoke. "It's a bad night to be bleeding on the streets," she said softly, her tone matter-of-fact. Vittorio's head snapped up. His dark eyes, usually cold and unreadable, flared with sudden, sharp intensity. He fixed her with a stare that had made hardened criminals stammer and sweat. It was a look that promised violence if she pressed further. "I suggest you mind your business and bring me a menu," he growled, the threat implicit in every syllable. Aurora didn't flinch. She met his gaze squarely, her brown eyes remarkably calm. She didn't back down, but she didn't provoke him either. She simply acknowledged his warning. She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a small folded cloth, a clean napkin she used to wipe down the counter. Without a word, she slid it across the table, stopping just short of his coffee cup. "I'll pretend I didn't see it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But you're ruining a very expensive coat. Press that against it. And if you start looking faint, I'm calling an ambulance, whether you like it or not. I don't need a dead body on my shift." Vittorio stared at the napkin, then up at her. For a moment, the silence between them was thick and heavy, punctuated only by the drumming of the rain outside. He was unaccustomed to defiance, and he was entirely unfamiliar with defiance wrapped in quiet concern. He expected fear. He received pragmatism. Before he could respond, the bell on the diner door jingled violently. 2 men burst in, shaking the water from their coats. They weren't looking for a meal. Their eyes swept the diner with predatory intensity, finally landing on the dark corner booth. Vittorio recognized them immediately. They were the men who had ambushed him. They had tracked him here. He subtly shifted his weight, his hand moving slowly, deliberately toward the inside of his jacket, ignoring the searing pain in his side. He was cornered, injured, and outnumbered. The odds were against him, and he knew it. Aurora, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, turned her head. She saw the men, saw the hard glint in their eyes, and then looked back at Vittorio. She realized with a sudden, chilling clarity that the danger she had sensed in him was not directed at her, but rather followed him like a shadow. And now, that shadow had entered her diner. The 2 men didn't run. They stalked toward Vittorio's booth with the deliberate heavy steps of men who knew they had their prey cornered. The diner, which seconds ago felt merely empty, now felt suffocatingly small. The solitary trucker, sensing the danger, quickly tossed a few bills on the table and hurried out the door, head down. The teenager in the corner remained blissfully asleep, unaware of the tension thickening the air. Vittorio remained perfectly still. His hand rested inside his coat, his fingers lightly brushing the cold steel of his weapon. He calculated the distance, the angles, the speed of his draw. It would be messy. In his current state, he couldn't guarantee a clean fight, and he certainly couldn't guarantee the safety of the waitress standing a few feet away. Aurora watched the men approach. She wasn't naive. Growing up in a rough neighborhood on the South Side, she knew what trouble looked like before it even announced itself. These men reeked of it. They wore ill-fitting suits and had faces scarred by violence. But more than their appearance, it was their posture, the aggressive forward lean, the hands hovering near their waistbands. She looked back at the man in the booth. His face was a mask of cold fury, but she noticed the slight tremor in his hand, the result of blood loss and pain. He was preparing to kill or be killed, right here in her diner. A surge of unexpected protective instinct mixed with sheer panic rose within her. She didn't want violence in her space, and strangely, she didn't want this injured stranger to die here. As the two men closed the distance, stopping just a few feet from the booth, the taller one smirked. "Well, well," he sneered, his voice loud and harsh in the quiet diner. "Looks like the big boss is slumming it. Didn't think we'd find you so easily, Gallo." Vittorio didn't reply. His eyes were locked on them, cold and assessing. He was waiting for the right moment. Aurora acted on pure, adrenaline-fueled impulse. She stepped directly between the men and the booth, her substantial frame blocking their view of Vittorio. She held a coffee pot in one hand and a rag in the other, adopting a posture of exaggerated, weary exasperation. "Excuse me," she said loudly, her voice cutting through the tension. "Are you gentlemen going to order, or are you just going to stand there dripping on my clean floor?" The taller man blinked, surprised by her intervention. He looked her up and down, a nasty grin forming. "Move aside, sweetheart. We're not here for coffee. We're having a private conversation." "The only private conversations happening here are between my customers and their food," Aurora retorted, refusing to budge. "Now, unless you want a slice of cherry pie or a black coffee, I suggest you take your conversation outside. This is a respectable establishment, not a street corner." The shorter man growled, reaching out to shove her aside. "I said, move, fat!" Before the word could fully leave his mouth, Vittorio moved. Despite his injury, he was fast. He grabbed the shorter man's wrist, twisting it sharply upward, and simultaneously kicked the back of the taller man's knee. The taller man buckled, and Vittorio dragged the shorter man down across the table, pinning his arm with brutal force. It happened in the span of 3 seconds. Vittorio leaned in close to the pinned man, his voice a low, terrifying whisper. "You lack manners, and you're interrupting my coffee." He didn't draw his weapon. He didn't need to. The sheer, overwhelming dominance of his presence was enough to freeze them. The taller man, scrambling to his feet, reached for his coat, but Vittorio shot him a look so deadly it stopped him cold. "Walk away," Vittorio commanded, his voice barely above a breath. "Now, before I decide to make this messy." The two men exchanged a panicked look. They had underestimated him, even injured. They backed away slowly, their bravado entirely shattered. Without another word, they turned and bolted out the door, disappearing into the rainy night. Vittorio released the shorter man with a shove, who stumbled backward before scrambling out after his partner. The diner fell silent again, save for the rain. Vittorio slumped back into the booth, breathing heavily. The brief exertion had cost him. He pressed his hand harder against his side, his face pale. Aurora stood frozen, the coffee pot still trembling slightly in her hand. She had just witnessed an explosion of violence, brief but intensely calculated. She stared at him, wide-eyed. Vittorio looked up at her, expecting fear, perhaps a scream or a frantic call to the police. Instead, he saw shock, quickly followed by concern. "You're an idiot," he said roughly, his voice strained. "You shouldn't have stepped in front of them." Aurora finally set the coffee pot down with a clatter. "And you shouldn't be bleeding all over my vinyl seats," she snapped back, her fear morphing into frustration. "I just saved you from a shootout in my diner, so a thank you wouldn't kill you." Vittorio stared at her, genuinely surprised. The audacity of this woman, a mere waitress, scolding him after he had just fended off 2 assassins, was absurd. Yet, it was the most genuine interaction he had experienced in months. He slowly reached for the napkin she had given him earlier and pressed it against his side under his coat. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling unfamiliar on his tongue. Aurora sighed, shaking her head. She walked around the counter and locked the front door, flipping the sign to closed. "What are you doing?" Vittorio asked sharply. "Saving my own life, apparently," she muttered. She walked to the back, returning a moment later with a surprisingly large first aid kit. She slapped it down on the table next to his coffee. "Take off the coat," she ordered. Vittorio hesitated. Exposing his injury, exposing his weakness, went against every instinct he possessed. "I'm fine. My men will be here soon." "Unless your men are doctors, they aren't going to stop you from bleeding out before they arrive," she retorted, crossing her arms. "I'm not letting you die in booth 4. It's bad for business." He looked at her, searching for an ulterior motive. He found none, only a stubborn determination to help. Slowly, painfully, he shrugged out of his overcoat, revealing the dark stain spreading across his white shirt. Aurora winced but didn't look away. She opened the kit, her hands moving efficiently. "My name is Aurora," she said softly, preparing a bandage. "Vittorio," he replied, watching her carefully. "Well, Vittorio," she said, her eyes meeting his for a brief moment. "This is going to sting." As she pressed the antiseptic to his side, he gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. He didn't make a sound, but his eyes never left hers. In that quiet diner, surrounded by the smell of antiseptic and old coffee, a silent understanding began to form between the invisible king of Chicago and the waitress who had refused to look away. Outside, the screech of tires tore through the night, accompanied by the slamming of car doors and the sound of heavy footsteps rushing toward the diner. The door handle rattled violently. Aurora froze, the bandage halfway secured. Vittorio immediately reached for his weapon again, his eyes locking onto the front door. His men hadn't arrived, but someone else had. The violent rattling of the locked door echoed through the silent diner like a gunshot. Aurora dropped the tape she was holding, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at Vittorio. His hand was already inside his coat, his face a mask of lethal focus. "Get down," he ordered, his voice a low, urgent hiss. Aurora didn't argue. She crouched behind the counter, pressing herself against the cold metal of the pie display case. She could hear the muffled voices outside, shouting over the rain. "It's locked! Break the glass!" Vittorio didn't move. He sat perfectly still in the booth, calculating the angles. He knew the layout of the diner now. He knew there was only one entrance and a small kitchen door in the back. If they broke the glass, he would have a clear shot, but he was outnumbered, and the odds of crossfire hitting Aurora were unacceptably high. Before the glass could shatter, a different sound cut through the noise, the distinct wail of police sirens approaching rapidly. The shouting outside abruptly stopped. There was the frantic scrambling of boots on the wet pavement, followed by the roar of an engine as a vehicle sped away, its tires squealing in protest. The red and blue lights washed over the front of the diner, strobing through the rain-streaked windows. Vittorio relaxed his grip on his weapon, letting out a tight breath. Aurora slowly peeked over the counter. "Are they gone?" she whispered. "For now," Vittorio said, his voice returning to its normal, cold register. "The police scared them off." He began to hurriedly button his shirt, wincing as the movement pulled at his bandaged side. He couldn't afford to be found here by the authorities, especially not with a bullet wound. "I need to leave," he said, grabbing his overcoat. Aurora stood up, wiping her hands on her apron. "You can't just walk out there. They'll ask questions, and you're still bleeding." "I have no choice," he replied, his tone final. He threw the coat over his shoulders, hiding the fresh bandage. He pulled a thick wad of bills from his pocket, more money than Aurora made in a month, and tossed it onto the table. "For the trouble. And the bandage." Aurora stared at the money, offended. She hadn't helped him for a payout. "I don't want your money," she said sharply. "I just wanted you to not die in my diner." Vittorio paused at the door, looking back at her. He wasn't used to people refusing his money. He studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable. "Keep it. Consider it rent for the booth." Without waiting for a reply, he unlocked the door and stepped out into the night, just as a police cruiser slowed to a halt in front of the diner. An officer rolled down the window. "Everything all right here, sir? We got a report of a disturbance." Vittorio, his posture suddenly relaxed, an aura of calm authority replacing his predatory tension, offered a smooth smile. "Just a minor disagreement between some patrons, officer. They left when they heard the sirens. Nothing to worry about." The officer eyed him, then glanced past him into the empty, brightly lit diner, where Aurora was vigorously wiping down a table, feigning nonchalance. "All right. You have a good night, sir," the officer said, rolling up the window and driving off. Vittorio stood in the rain for a moment longer, watching the taillights disappear. He then turned and walked briskly down the street, disappearing into the shadows before his own men, who arrived minutes later in a fleet of black SUVs, finally found him. The next few weeks passed with excruciating slowness for Aurora. The incident at the diner felt like a bizarre, violent dream. She continued her routine, working the late shift, dealing with difficult customers, and returning to her small, cramped apartment on the south side. She tried to forget the man with the dark eyes and the blood-stained shirt, but the memory lingered, a sharp contrast to her mundane existence. She hadn't touched the money he left. It sat in an envelope at the bottom of her drawer, feeling heavy with unspoken implications. Vittorio Gallo, however, found himself entirely unable to forget the fat waitress who had scolded him. His world was one of constant vigilance, of power plays and betrayals. He was surrounded by people who either feared him or wanted his throne. He had never encountered someone who looked at him without fear or avarice, someone who simply saw a wounded man and offered a napkin. He had his men investigate her. It was a standard precaution, he told himself. He needed to ensure she wasn't a plant, a spy working for a rival family. Matteo, his second-in-command, a sharp-featured man with eyes like polished stones, delivered the report a week later in Vittorio's opulent, dimly lit office. Aurora Laurent, 32, single, works 6 nights a week at the Midnight Owl, lives alone in a studio apartment, no criminal record, no known associates with any family. Her bank account is nearly empty. She's clean, boss, just an ordinary waitress. Vittorio listened, staring at the glowing embers of his cigar. An ordinary waitress. Yet she had stood between him and 2 armed men. She had bandaged his wound with steady hands and scolded him for bleeding on her seats. "Keep an eye on her," Vittorio ordered softly. "From a distance. Make sure no one bothers her." Matteo raised an eyebrow, surprised. Vittorio Gallo did not extend his protection lightly, and certainly not to ordinary civilians. "Are you sure, boss? She's a nobody." Vittorio's gaze snapped to Matteo, cold and hard. "She did me a service. We pay our debts. See to it." "Understood," Matteo replied quickly, backing out of the office. A month later, the first snow of the season began to fall, blanketing the grimy streets in temporary white. Aurora was closing up the diner, her hands raw from hot water and bleach. She was exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that settled deep into the bones. She flipped the closed sign, locked the door, and began her walk to the bus stop. The wind was bitter, cutting through her thin winter coat. She pulled her scarf tighter, her mind numb with fatigue. As she waited at the deserted bus stop, the snow swirling around her, a sleek, black Lincoln Continental pulled up to the curb. It was a car that didn't belong in this neighborhood. The rear window rolled down smoothly, revealing the shadowed interior. "Get in," a low, familiar voice commanded. Aurora stiffened, her breath catching in her throat. She recognized the voice instantly. It was the man from the diner. Vittorio. She took a step back, her heart beginning to race. "I'm fine, thank you. The bus will be here soon." "It's 20 degrees and that bus isn't coming for another hour," Vittorio said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Get in, Aurora." She hesitated. Getting into a car with a man she suspected was a dangerous criminal was a terrible idea. But the cold was seeping into her skin, and the quiet authority in his voice was oddly compelling. He knew her name. Slowly she approached the car. She pulled the heavy door open and slid into the back seat. The interior was warm, smelling of expensive leather and a faint hint of cologne. Vittorio sat on the other side, immaculately dressed in a dark suit, his face impassive. He didn't look at her, simply nodding to the driver. "Where are we going?" Aurora asked, her voice trembling slightly, not entirely from the cold. "To get dinner," Vittorio replied simply, his eyes fixed on the snowy streets ahead. "You owe me a conversation." "And I owe you a meal." The car pulled away from the curb, leaving the deserted bus stop behind, plunging Aurora into a world she knew nothing about. The silence in the car was heavy, pregnant with unasked questions. "I didn't think you'd remember me," Aurora finally said, the quiet slipping from her grasp. Vittorio finally turned to look at her, his dark eyes intense and unreadable in the dim light. "I remember everyone who bleeds on me, Aurora," he said softly. "And everyone who refuses to run." The car turned down a narrow, dark alley, the streetlights fading behind them, and stopped abruptly before a heavy steel door that looked like the entrance to a fortress. The heavy steel door slid open with a metallic groan, revealing an underground parking garage bathed in harsh fluorescent light. The Lincoln glided smoothly inside, the tires squeaking softly against the polished concrete. Aurora stared out the window, her unease growing. This wasn't a restaurant, this was a stronghold. Vittorio didn't speak as the car came to a halt. A man in a dark suit immediately opened his door, bowing slightly. Another moved to open Aurora's door. She hesitated, clutching her worn purse tightly before stepping out. The air in the garage was cool and smelled of exhaust and damp concrete. "This way," Vittorio said, his voice curt. He didn't wait for her, walking briskly toward a set of private elevators. He walked with a slight, barely perceptible stiffness, the only lingering sign of the wound she had bandaged weeks ago. Aurora hurried to keep up, acutely aware of the armed men positioned discreetly near the elevator banks. They didn't look at her, their eyes focused outward, an invisible wall of security. The elevator ascended silently, the numbers flashing above the door. 10, 15, 20. When the doors finally opened, they didn't reveal a hallway, but a sprawling, luxurious penthouse. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking, panoramic view of the Chicago skyline, the city lights twinkling through the falling snow like scattered diamonds. The interior was a study in aggressive modernism, dark leather, polished steel, and minimalist art that looked expensive and cold. It was beautiful, but it felt entirely devoid of life. It felt like a gilded cage. "Make yourself comfortable," Vittorio said, tossing his overcoat onto a nearby chair. He walked toward a massive mahogany bar and poured himself a dark amber liquid. "Drink?" "Water is fine," Aurora said, her voice small in the cavernous space. She didn't sit. She stood awkwardly near the entrance, feeling entirely out of place in her faded coat and sensible shoes. Vittorio poured the water and handed it to her, his fingers briefly brushing hers. His skin was warm, a sharp contrast to the coldness of his environment. "You're nervous," he observed, leaning against the bar, studying her. "I'm standing in a penthouse that looks like it belongs to a movie villain, with a man who travels with armed guards, Aurora replied dryly, her pragmatic nature resurfacing despite her fear. Nervous is an understatement. I'm currently debating if I should ask where you hid the bodies. A flicker of surprise, followed by something that almost looked like amusement, crossed Vittorio's face. It was gone in an instant. There are no bodies here, he said smoothly. Only dinner. As if on cue, an older woman with kind eyes and an apron emerged from a side door, carrying a silver tray laden with covered dishes. She offered a warm smile to Vittorio and a curious glance at Aurora before setting the food on a heavy oak dining table. "Grazie, Maria," Vittorio murmured. The woman nodded and disappeared back into the kitchen. "Sit," Vittorio commanded softly, gesturing to the table. Aurora complied, taking a seat opposite him. The food was extraordinary. Handmade pasta, perfectly seared veal, and a complex red wine that Vittorio poured for himself. Aurora picked at her food, the rich aromas failing to stimulate her appetite. They ate in silence for several minutes. The quiet wasn't the comfortable silence of old friends. It was a heavy, probing silence, like two chess players studying the board before the first move. "Why did you bring me here?" Aurora finally asked, setting her fork down. "You left money. The debt, if you think there was one, was paid." Vittorio took a slow sip of his wine. He wasn't accustomed to explaining himself. He operated on instinct and command. Bringing her here had been an impulse, a sudden desire to understand the anomaly she represented. "I don't like debts," he answered truthfully. "And I don't like mysteries." "I'm not a mystery," Aurora scoffed gently. "I'm a waitress who works too many hours and lives in a bad neighborhood. My life is entirely predictable." "Yet you stood in front of two armed men to protect a stranger," he countered, his gaze locking onto hers. "That is not predictable. That is foolishness or bravery. I haven't decided which." Aurora met his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "It was neither. I just didn't want the paperwork of a murder in my diner. And you looked terrible." Vittorio actually chuckled, a low, rusty sound that surprised both of them. "Pragmatism. I can respect that." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "My name is Vittorio Gallo. I run certain interests in this city. You know what I am, even if you won't say the word." "A criminal," Aurora said bluntly, not flinching. Vittorio's expression hardened slightly, but he nodded. "A boss. The head of a family. People fear me, Aurora. They respect me, they hate me, they betray me, but they do not offer me a napkin when I am bleeding." He paused, his eyes searching her face, looking for the deception he was so used to finding in others. He found none. Only a quiet, cautious intelligence. "You treated me like a man," he said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying an unfamiliar vulnerability. "Not a monster. Not a meal ticket." Aurora looked at him, truly looked at him, past the expensive suit and the intimidating aura. She saw a man who was deeply, fundamentally alone. A man surrounded by people, yet entirely isolated by power. "I treated you like someone who needed help," she said softly. "It doesn't matter what you do. Pain is pain." The air between them crackled with an unspoken tension. Vittorio felt a strange, terrifying shift within himself. He, the man who trusted no one, felt an irrational urge to trust the woman sitting across from him. Suddenly, the intercom on the wall buzzed sharply, a jarring intrusion into the quiet moment. Vittorio frowned, his hand instinctively moving toward his jacket. He walked over and pressed the button. "Yes?" Matteo's voice came through, distorted but urgent. "Boss, we have a problem. The Barzini crew. They've moved on the south side of territory. They took out 3 of our men at the docks." Vittorio's face transformed instantly. The vulnerability vanished, replaced by a cold, murderous fury. The boss was back. "Assemble the capos. I'll be down in 2 minutes," he snapped, his voice entirely devoid of warmth. He turned back to Aurora, his expression closed off, an impenetrable wall. The moment of connection was shattered. "Dinner is over," he said coldly. "My driver will take you home." He didn't wait for her to respond. He grabbed his coat and strode toward the private elevator, leaving Aurora alone in the massive, echoing penthouse, the cold reality of his world crashing down around her. As the elevator doors closed behind him, Aurora realized with a sinking feeling that stepping into Vittorio Gallo's world was easy. Stepping out of it, however, might be impossible. The drive back to the south side was a stark descent from the sterile luxury of the penthouse. The driver, a silent mountain of a man, navigated the snowy streets with practiced ease, but the heavy silence in the car felt oppressive. Aurora stared out the window, watching the familiar, grimy brick buildings replace the glittering high-rises. She felt a complex knot of emotions: relief at leaving that gilded cage, a lingering fear of the man she had just eaten dinner with, and disturbingly, a strange sense of disappointment. For a brief moment, beneath the veneer of the crime boss, she had seen something fragile in Vittorio, but it had vanished the moment violence called his name. When the Lincoln pulled up to her apartment building, its rusted fire escape and peeling paint starkly illuminated by the street lamp, the driver didn't just unlock the doors. He stepped out, opening her door and waiting until she was safely inside the small, dimly lit lobby. It was a terrifying realization. Vittorio Gallo wasn't just observing her. He was protecting her. And in his world, protection was a possessive act. The next few weeks were tense. The city felt different. The news was filled with vague reports of gang-related violence on the docks and in the warehouses. Aurora knew exactly who was responsible. She continued her shifts at the diner, jumping every time the bell jingled, expecting men in cheap suits to walk in. But they never did. The Midnight Owl remained an untouched sanctuary, an eerie calm amidst a storm she knew was raging outside. One Tuesday evening, the diner was quiet. Aurora was wiping down the counter, her mind wandering, when the door opened. It wasn't an assassin, nor was it Vittorio. It was a woman. She was stunning, radiating an aggressive, expensive elegance. She wore a tailored crimson coat that flared at the waist, perfectly styled raven hair, and stiletto heels that clicked sharply against the linoleum. She looked entirely out of place in the diner, like an exotic bird in a pigeon coop. The woman didn't sit in a booth. She walked straight to the counter, her dark eyes locking onto Aurora with a cold, assessing stare. "You must be Aurora," she said. Her voice was smooth, cultured, but laced with an undeniable undercurrent of hostility. Aurora set down her rag, her instincts flaring. "Can I help you?" "I'm Isabella," the woman said, leaning slightly against the counter, though careful not to let her coat touch the surface. Isabella Barzini. The name hit Aurora like a physical blow. Barzini. The family Matteo had mentioned on the intercom, the family Vittorio was currently at war with. Aurora kept her face neutral, though her heart began to race. "I don't know anyone by that name. Are you looking to order?" Isabella laughed, a sharp, mirthless sound. "Oh, please, don't play the ignorant waitress with me. I know who you are, and I know what you mean to him." "I don't mean anything to anyone," Aurora replied firmly, her hands gripping the edge of the counter to hide their trembling. "I serve coffee and pie. That's it." Isabella's eyes narrowed, a flash of genuine anger breaking through her composed facade. Vittorio Gallo is a ghost. He doesn't bring ordinary women to his penthouse. He doesn't place guards outside their miserable little apartments. Aurora froze. Guards? She hadn't seen anyone, but Isabella's confidence was terrifying. "He's distracted," Isabella continued, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "My father is tearing his territory apart, and Vittorio is playing house with a commoner. It's pathetic." "I have nothing to do with your family's business, or his," Aurora said, her voice rising slightly, demanding authority she didn't feel. "I suggest you leave before I call the police." Isabella scoffed, stepping back. "The police? How quaint. You really don't understand the game you've stumbled into, do you?" She pulled a pair of leather gloves from her pocket, slipping them on with deliberate slowness. "Vittorio is weak right now, and weakness in our world is a death sentence. You are his weakness, Aurora." Isabella turned toward the door, pausing with her hand on the handle. "If you care about him at all, or if you care about your own life, you'll disappear. Because when my family takes over, they won't be as polite as I am." The door jingled shut behind her, leaving Aurora standing in the quiet diner, the air suddenly feeling thin and cold. Isabella hadn't just delivered a threat. She had delivered a revelation. Aurora wasn't just an observer anymore. She was a target. Later that night, long after her shift ended, Aurora sat in the dark of her apartment, staring out the window at the empty street below. She looked for the guards Isabella had mentioned, but the shadows hid everything. She needed to leave. That was the logical, safe choice. Pack a bag, buy a bus ticket, and disappear before she became collateral damage in a war she didn't understand. But another thought, quieter but more persistent, anchored her to the floor. Vittorio. She remembered the look in his eyes when he talked about the isolation of power. She remembered the warmth of his fingers brushing against hers. If she ran, she proved Isabella right. She proved that the only thing people felt for Vittorio Gallo was fear. The silence of her apartment was shattered by the harsh ringing of her cell phone. It was an unknown number. She hesitated, then answered, her voice tight. "Hello?" "Aurora." It was Vittorio. His voice sounded rougher than usual, strained and exhausted. "Are you safe?" he asked, skipping any greeting. "Isabella Barzini visited me at the diner tonight," Aurora said, deciding honesty was her only weapon. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, followed by a string of harsh, whispered Italian curses. "I have men watching you, but they shouldn't have let her inside. I will deal with them," Vittorio growled, his voice vibrating with sudden, terrifying rage. "Pack a bag. Only essentials. I'm sending Matteo to get you right now." "Vittorio, wait. No waiting," he cut her off, the commanding boss returning instantly. "You are no longer safe there. You're coming to the estate. Matteo will be there in 5 minutes." The line went dead. Aurora stared at the phone. She had spent the last hour debating if she should run away from him. Now, she was about to run directly to him, stepping fully out of her world and into the heart of his. A knock sounded at her door. It wasn't a polite tap. It was a firm, urgent rap that echoed in the small hallway. Matteo had arrived. The drive out of the city was a blur of neon lights, giving way to dark, sprawling suburbs. Aurora sat in the back of the SUV, clutching a small duffel bag, next to Matteo. He didn't speak, his eyes constantly scanning the mirrors, his hand resting casually near his waist. The tension in the car was thick enough to choke on. They arrived at the Gallo estate an hour later. It wasn't a penthouse, it was a fortress. High stone walls, topped with wrought iron spikes, surrounded a massive, sprawling mansion built in a heavy, imposing Romanesque style. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, and massive iron gates swung open only after a rigorous security check. This was where the Gallo family ruled from. This was the lion's den. Matteo escorted her inside, the heavy oak doors closing with a thud that felt terribly final. The interior was grand, filled with dark wood, antique rugs, and the quiet murmur of men conducting business in hushed tones. It smelled of old money and power. "Wait here," Matteo said, leaving her in a small, elegant antechamber. Aurora stood stiffly, feeling like a fragile glass ornament in a room full of hammers. She had packed her life into a small bag, leaving behind the only world she knew, based on a single phone call from a man who frightened her as much as he intrigued her. 10 minutes passed before the double doors to the main study opened. Vittorio stood in the doorway. He looked worse than when she had seen him at the penthouse. He was jacketless, his shirt sleeves rolled up, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. He looked exhausted, carrying the weight of a war he was currently losing. But when his eyes landed on her, the harshness in his face softened for a fraction of a second. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. She walked into the study. It was a massive room, lined with bookshelves, dominated by a large mahogany desk covered in maps, ledgers, and secure phones. The air was thick with the smell of stale cigar smoke. Vittorio closed the doors behind her, ensuring they were completely alone. "Did she hurt you?" he asked immediately, closing the distance between them. He didn't touch her, but he stood close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. "No," Aurora said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "She just talked. She wanted me to know that I'm your weakness." Vittorio's jaw clenched, a muscle feathering in his cheek. He turned away, walking behind his desk, pacing like a caged animal. "Isabella is a snake," he said, his voice hard. "Her father, Don Barzini, is trying to squeeze us out of the shipping lanes. He thinks we're vulnerable because He trailed off, shaking his head. "Because you what?" Aurora pressed gently, stepping closer to the desk. "Because you saved a waitress?" Vittorio stopped pacing and looked at her. "Because I let myself be distracted," he admitted, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "In my world, focus is survival. The moment you look away, they strike." He sat heavily in his leather chair, running a hand through his dark hair. "I brought you here because you aren't safe in the city anymore. They will use you to get to me." "So I'm a hostage?" Aurora asked, her pragmatic nature rising to the surface. "You're under my protection," Vittorio corrected sharply. "You will stay here until this is resolved. You'll have everything you need." "Everything except my freedom," she countered. Vittorio looked up at her, a complex mix of frustration and something deeper swirling in his eyes. "Freedom is an illusion, Aurora. You were free, and a Barzini walked into your diner to threaten your life. Here, you are safe. Safe, but trapped," she murmured, looking around the opulent, suffocating room. She took a deep breath, deciding to push past her fear. She walked around the desk, standing directly beside his chair. She saw the maps, the markers indicating lost territories, the sheer scale of the conflict he was managing alone. "You're losing," she stated quietly, looking at the map. Vittorio stiffened. His pride stung. He opened his mouth to deny it, to assert his dominance, but looking at her clear, uncompromising gaze, the lie died in his throat. "Barzini has the numbers," he admitted, his voice low, tired. "He bought off the police commissioner. He's squeezing our supply lines. My capos are getting nervous. They want me to retaliate blindly, to start a war in the streets." "But you won't," she guessed. "A street war brings the feds. It ruins business for everyone," he explained. "I need a precise strike, I need to cut off the head, not fight the body. But I can't find a weakness." Aurora looked at the map again. She didn't know anything about shipping lanes or Mafia politics, but she knew people. She had spent a decade watching them in the diner, observing how they acted when they thought no one was looking. "Isabella," Aurora said suddenly. Vittorio frowned. "What about her?" "She came to see me herself," Aurora pointed out. "Why? Why not send a thug? Why would the daughter of a Don risk walking into your territory just to deliver a threat to a waitress?" Vittorio leaned back, considering her words. Arrogance, stupidity, or insecurity, Aurora countered. She was angry, Vittorio, not just cold and calculating. She was furious that you were distracted. She wanted to prove she was better, smarter. Aurora pointed to a specific point on the map, a high-end restaurant in the Gold Coast district. She mentioned this place when she was talking about her father's power. She said he owns the politicians there. Vittorio sat up straight, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the map. The Valerius Club. Barzini uses it to launder money and bribe city officials. It's his political stronghold. If you want to cut off his head, you don't attack his soldiers, Aurora said, her voice steady, surprised by her own strategic thinking. You attack his money and his influence. You humiliate him where he thinks he's untouchable. Vittorio stared at her, genuinely astounded. This woman, who served pie for a living, had just articulated a strategy his seasoned capos had missed in their blind rage. She saw the emotional undercurrents that drove their enemies, the vanities that could be exploited. He stood up slowly, stepping close to her. The air between them shifted, the tension turning from fear to an intense, magnetic pull. "You are—" He started, his voice a low murmur, his eyes dropping to her lips before meeting her gaze again. "Extraordinary." Before he could say more, before she could process the sudden vulnerability in his gaze, the heavy study doors burst open. Matteo stood there, his face pale, breathing heavily. "Boss," Matteo gasped. "It's the Northside warehouse. Barzini just hit it. They didn't just attack, they set it on fire. The whole block is going up." Vittorio's expression hardened instantly. The moment of connection shattered by the brutal reality of his world. The war had escalated. The scent of burning chemicals and old wood was acrid, clinging to the heavy winter air, miles before they even reached the warehouse. Aurora sat in the back of the armored SUV, wedged between Matteo and another guard, while Vittorio rode in the lead car. The silence in the vehicle was a tight, vibrating thing, suffocating in its intensity. Vittorio hadn't wanted to bring her. He had ordered her to stay in the estate, guarded by his best men. But as he turned to leave the study, the sheer panic in his eyes, a panic not for his territory, but for the loss of control, had moved her. "If I stay here alone, I'm just waiting to be a target," she had argued, her voice surprisingly steady. "If Isabella knows I'm your weakness, she'll send someone here the moment you're distracted by the fire." It was a gamble, challenging his authority in front of his men. But it worked. Vittorio, his mind racing with strategy, saw the terrifying logic in her words. He needed her where he could see her. Now, as the convoy tore through the deserted streets, Aurora realized the gravity of her choice. The glow of the fire painted the low-hanging clouds an angry, violent orange, long before the warehouse came into view. When they arrived, the scene was pure chaos. The massive structure, a critical hub for the Gallo family's legitimate and illegitimate imports, was entirely engulfed in flames. Fire trucks surrounded the perimeter, their sirens wailing, struggling to contain the blaze. The heat was a physical blow, pushing against the windows of the SUV. Vittorio stepped out of the lead car, his silhouette stark against the raging inferno. He didn't look like a man who had just lost millions. He looked like a statue, carved from cold stone, watching his empire burn. Aurora cracked her window slightly, overwhelmed by the roar of the fire and the shouting of men. Matteo leaned forward, his face grim. "It's a total loss, boss," Matteo yelled over the noise, stepping up beside Vittorio. They timed it perfectly, hit the security detail, disabled the sprinklers, and ignited the chemical stores. Vittorio didn't reply immediately. He watched the flames lick the night sky, his mind calculating the damage, not just in dollars but in reputation. Barzini had struck a massive blow. This wasn't a skirmish. This was a declaration of total war. "Where are our men?" Vittorio finally asked, his voice cutting through the chaos with terrifying calm. "We lost 5, Matteo reported, his voice tight. "The rest are securing the perimeter, making sure the fire doesn't spread to the residential block." Aurora watched Vittorio. The man who had been gentle with her in the study, who had listened to her advice, was gone. In his place was the Don, the ruthless leader who understood that in this world, blood demanded blood. Suddenly, a shout rang out from the far side of the loading docks. A group of men, silhouetted by the fire, emerged from the shadows. They weren't firefighters, and they weren't gallows soldiers. "Barzini's men!" a guard yelled, raising his weapon. The ambush was unexpected. The Barzini crew had stayed behind to ensure the destruction, and now they were attempting to finish the job by taking out the Gallo leadership while they were distracted by the fire. Gunfire erupted, the sharp cracks echoing over the roar of the flames. "Get down!" Matteo roared, shoving Aurora roughly down onto the seat of the SUV as bullets pinged violently against the armored glass. Aurora curled into a ball, squeezing her eyes shut, the deafening noise drowning out her own terrified breathing. This was the reality of his world, a reality she had foolishly stepped into. Outside, Vittorio didn't dive for cover. He moved with lethal precision, drawing his weapon and returning fire, his face an emotionless mask. He was a force of nature, a general directing his troops amidst the chaos. The skirmish was intense, but brief. The Gallo men, though surprised, were better trained and heavily armed. They quickly overwhelmed the remaining Barzini soldiers, driving them back into the shadows. When the shooting stopped, an eerie silence settled over the immediate area, broken only by the crackling of the dying fire. Aurora slowly lifted her head, looking out the spider-webbed glass. She saw Vittorio standing amidst the wreckage, his weapon still drawn, staring into the darkness where the attackers had fled. He looked isolated, untouchable, and terribly alone. Matteo opened the door. "Are you all right?" he asked her, his voice gruff but concerned. Aurora nodded, numb. She stepped out of the SUV, her legs shaking slightly. She didn't walk toward the safety of the guards. She walked toward Vittorio. He heard her approach and turned, his gun instantly lowering. His eyes, usually cold and unreadable, flared with a sudden, desperate relief when he saw she was unharmed. The mask of the Don slipped, revealing the man beneath. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, his hands coming up to grip her shoulders firmly. He didn't speak. He just looked at her, his eyes searching her face, ensuring she was truly safe. In that chaotic, fire-lit moment, amidst the ruins of his empire, the truth crystallized between them. The careful distance they had maintained, the boundaries of boss and civilian, shattered completely. Aurora reached up, her hand trembling slightly, and pressed her palm against his chest, right over his heart. It was beating violently. "I'm okay," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the noise. Vittorio closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, resting his forehead against hers. It was an incredibly intimate, vulnerable gesture. a surrender he had never allowed himself before. "I will kill them for this," he murmured, his voice thick with a deadly promise. "I will burn their entire world to ash." He opened his eyes, and the terrifying coldness was back, but this time it wasn't directed at her. It was a protective fury. He turned to Matteo, who was watching them with a mixture of shock and dawning understanding. "Call the capos," Vittorio ordered, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "Tell them to prepare. Tomorrow night, we take the Valerius Club. We take Barzini's money, his influence, and his pride." He looked back at Aurora, his gaze unwavering. She had given him the strategy. Now he would execute it. The defensive war was over. "We strike back," Vittorio declared. The Valerius Club was a bastion of old-world arrogance, nestled in the heart of the Gold Coast. It wasn't merely a restaurant, it was a sanctuary where politicians, judges, and high-rolling criminals mingled under the guise of civility, shielded by velvet ropes and a staggering entry fee. Don Barzini practically owned it. It was his crown jewel, the center of his corrupt web. And tonight, Vittorio Gallo was going to shatter it. Aurora stood in the shadows of an alley across the street, watching the sleek luxury cars pull up to the club's valet. She felt entirely out of her depth, clutching a small earpiece tight in her ear. She was dressed in a simple, dark coat, blending into the Chicago night. She had insisted on coming. When Vittorio had finalized the plan in the war room, she had argued that if her strategy was going to be used, she needed to see it through. He had refused fiercely, their argument echoing through the estate. But in the end, her stubborn pragmatism won. She was his eyes on the outside, a civilian face that the Barzini watchers wouldn't immediately flag. "Position secure," Matteo's voice crackled softly in her ear. He was leading the tactical team through the club's subterranean delivery entrance. "I'm in," came Vittorio's voice, calm and chillingly smooth. Vittorio wasn't sneaking in. He was walking through the front door. Aurora watched from the alley as Vittorio, dressed impeccably in a bespoke tuxedo, strode up to the velvet ropes. He didn't look like a man leading a raid. He looked like a king arriving at a banquet. The bouncers, huge men accustomed to intimidating the elite, visibly tensed as he approached. They recognized him. Everyone in their world recognized him. Through the earpiece, Aurora heard the exchange. "Mr. Gallo," the head bouncer said, his voice tight. "This is a private club. You're not on the list." "I'm making a withdrawal," Vittorio replied softly. The sound of a suppressed gunshot, barely a thwip through the earpiece, followed instantly. The bouncer slumped forward. "Front door is clear. Move in," Vittorio commanded. The operation was a masterclass in precision, far removed from the chaotic street battles Barzini favored. Vittorio's men flooded the club, moving like ghosts, securing the exits, neutralizing the guards, and seizing the main floor before the patrons even realized what was happening. Aurora heard the sudden, muted screams and the crashing of glass over the comms, but Vittorio's voice remained unnervingly calm, directing his men. "Secure the VIP lounge, locate the ledgers." The plan wasn't just a massacre, it was an extraction. They were there to steal Barzini's blackmail material, the very leverage he used to control the city's politicians. By taking the ledgers, Vittorio would cripple Barzini's political shield, leaving him vulnerable to the authorities and his rivals. Minutes ticked by, feeling like hours. Aurora stood perfectly still, her heart hammering, praying for a swift resolution. Then a new voice cut through the comms, a voice filled with panic and rage. "Gallo, you son of a bitch!" It was Don Barzini. He was supposed to be at his estate, but he was here, in the club's private office. The intelligence had been slightly off. "Barzini," Vittorio said, his tone conversational, as if he were greeting a neighbor. "I see you're working late. You think you can just walk in here? My men are on their way. You're a dead man, Barzini snarled. Your men are currently burning in a warehouse on the south side. Vittorio lied smoothly, knowing the psychological impact was more important than the truth in that moment. And your political friends? They'll be receiving copies of these ledgers by morning. You have nothing left, Don Barzini. A sudden, sharp scuffle echoed through the earpiece. A gunshot, unsuppressed and deafening, rang out, making Aurora gasp and press her hand against the wall. "Vittorio!" she whispered fiercely into the comms. Silence answered her. Panic clawed at her throat. "Matteo, what happened? Vittorio!" 10 agonizing seconds passed. The silence was heavier than the gunfire. Finally, a heavy sigh crackled through the speaker. "He's dead," Vittorio said, his voice weary but steady. "Barzini tried to draw on me. It's over." A massive weight lifted off Aurora's chest, replaced instantly by a new, urgent terror. Sirens began to wail in the distance, growing louder rapidly. The police were responding to the unsuppressed shot. "The police are coming, Vittorio. You have to leave, now," she urged into the microphone. "We have the ledgers. We're moving to the extraction point," Vittorio replied. "Matteo, clear the floor." Aurora watched anxiously as the heavy doors of the club swung open, patrons streaming out in a panicked rush, scattering into the night. Amidst the chaos, she spotted the dark SUVs pulling up to the side entrance. She saw Vittorio emerge, flanked by his men, holding a sleek black briefcase. He looked unharmed, moving with a fast, deliberate stride toward the lead vehicle. Just as he reached the car door, he paused, looking directly across the street, straight into the shadows of the alley where Aurora was standing. Even from that distance, even in the dark, she felt the intensity of his gaze lock onto her. He gave a sharp, definitive nod, an acknowledgement of her role, a silent promise. He slid into the SUV, and the convoy sped off into the night, disappearing seconds before the police cruisers swarmed the Valerius Club. The war was over. Vittorio had won. He had destroyed Barzini's empire and secured his own throne. But as Aurora stepped out of the alley, pulling her coat tighter against the chill, she realized the hardest battle was just beginning. She had helped a Mafia boss win a war. She had stepped fully into the darkness. Now she had to figure out if she could ever step back into the light, or if she even wanted to. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. A single text message from an unknown number. "Meet me at the penthouse." The penthouse felt different tonight. The sterile, aggressive modernism seemed softer, the harsh edges blurred by the dim lighting and the profound silence that hung in the air. The war was won, the city was quiet, and the heavy burden of survival had momentarily lifted. Aurora stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the glittering expanse of Chicago. The city looked beautiful from up here, clean and distant, hiding the violence and grime she knew intimately. She heard the soft hum of the private elevator before the doors opened. Vittorio stepped out. He had discarded the tuxedo jacket, his bow tie hanging loose around his neck. He looked exhausted, the adrenaline of the night finally wearing off, leaving behind a profound weariness. He didn't speak immediately. He walked over to the bar, poured 2 glasses of the dark amber liquor, and carried them over, offering one to her. "To victory?" she asked softly, taking the glass, though she had no intention of drinking it. Vittorio looked at the amber liquid, then out at the city. "To survival," he corrected quietly. He took a slow sip. He turned to face her, leaning against the cold glass of the window. The distance between them was only a few feet, but the emotional chasm felt massive. They had survived a war together, bound by necessity and danger. Now, in the quiet aftermath, they had to confront what remained. "You shouldn't have been there tonight," Vittorio said, his voice low, lacking its usual sharp edge. It was too dangerous. It was my plan, Aurora countered, her gaze steady. I wasn't going to hide in your mansion while you executed it. You are stubborn, he observed, a faint, weary smile touching his lips. Pragmatic, she corrected gently. Vittorio set his glass down on a nearby side table. He stepped closer, eliminating the space between them. The scent of him, expensive cologne mixed with the faint, metallic tang of adrenaline, enveloped her. You saved my life in that diner, he began, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. You gave me the strategy to win this war. You stood in the fire with me. Why? Aurora looked up into his dark eyes. They were completely open to her now, entirely devoid of the guarded coldness he showed the world. Because I saw a man, not a monster, she answered truthfully. Because despite everything you are, you didn't let those men die needlessly tonight. You strike with precision, not cruelty. She paused, taking a deep breath, knowing her next words would change everything. And because I couldn't walk away, even when Isabella threatened me, even when the warehouse burned, I couldn't leave you alone in the dark. Vittorio's breath caught. For a man who controlled an empire through fear and calculated violence, hearing someone confess to caring for him, not his power, not his money, but him, was a terrifying, earth-shattering revelation. He reached up, his large, calloused hand gently cupping her face. His thumb brushed softly across her cheekbone, a gesture of profound tenderness that felt alien yet entirely natural. I have spent my life building walls, Aurora, he murmured, his forehead resting against hers. I trust no one. I love no one. Because attachment is a weakness. It is a blade they can use to cut you. He pulled back slightly, looking deeply into her eyes. But you slipped past the walls. You didn't ask for permission. You just walked in. He kissed her. It wasn't the aggressive, possessive kiss of a conqueror. It was a slow, deliberate surrender. It was the desperate, drowning grasp of a man who had finally found air after a lifetime underwater. Aurora responded, her hands coming up to grip his shoulders, anchoring him. The kiss was a collision of two entirely different worlds, a violent friction that smoothed into a desperate, clinging heat. All the tension, the fear, and the unspoken longing of the past weeks poured into that single moment. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Vittorio rested his hands on her waist, holding her close as if he feared she might vanish. Stay with me, he said, his voice fierce, demanding, yet entirely vulnerable. Don't go back to the diner. Don't go back to the south side. Stay here, with me. Aurora looked at the luxurious penthouse, then at the man holding her. It was a seductive offer, a life of absolute security, of immense power. But she knew the cost. She gently placed her hands over his, stepping back slightly, breaking the physical connection. I can't, Vittorio, she said softly, the words tearing at her own heart. Vittorio's expression hardened instantly, the vulnerability vanishing, replaced by a flash of panic and the immediate rise of the boss's authority. Why? Is it the danger? The Barzinis are gone. You are safe. I will ensure. It's not the danger, she interrupted, shaking her head. It's the cage. She looked out the window. This is your world. A world built on violence and control. If I stay here, I become a possession. Something you protect. Something you hide away. I become exactly what Isabella said I was. A weakness you have to manage. She looked back at him, her eyes filled with sorrow but absolute resolve. I am a waitress, Vittorio. I work hard. I live a simple life. It's not glamorous, but it's mine. If I stay here, I lose myself. I just become gallows woman." Vittorio stared at her, the truth of her words hitting him harder than any bullet. He wanted to argue, to command her to stay, to use his power to keep her. But he knew, with sudden, crushing clarity, that forcing her would destroy the very thing he loved about her, her independent, pragmatic spirit. "So you're leaving," he said, his voice hollow, the cold mask slipping back into place, a necessary defense mechanism against the pain. "I'm going home," Aurora corrected gently. "I'll go back to the diner. I'll go back to my life." She picked up her worn coat from the chair where she had left it. She didn't look back as she walked toward the elevator. Vittorio didn't stop her. He stood frozen, a king in his castle, watching the only real thing in his life walk away, realizing that all his power was entirely useless in the face of her quiet strength. The elevator doors closed, taking her away. The penthouse, once again, felt entirely devoid of life. 6 months had passed since the night the Valerius Club fell. The Chicago winter had melted into a humid, sticky summer. For Aurora, life had returned to a comforting, exhausting rhythm. She worked her shifts at the Midnight Owl, dealt with the late-night crowds, and returned to her small apartment. The memory of Vittorio Gallo and the world she had briefly inhabited felt like a vivid, impossible fever dream. She watched the news occasionally, seeing subtle shifts in the city's underbelly, clean, bloodless corporate takeovers that bore the hallmark of Vittorio's precise strategy. He was thriving. She missed him. It was a quiet, persistent ache that she buried under a mountain of practicalities. She missed the intensity of his gaze, the surprising warmth behind his cold exterior, and the feeling of being entirely seen by a man who noticed everything. But she knew she had made the right choice. She had preserved her own identity, refusing to become a shadowed accessory in a dangerous world. It was a Tuesday night, raining steadily, much like the night they had first met. The diner was quiet. Aurora was wiping down the counter, the smell of bleach and old coffee comforting in its familiarity. The bell above the door jingled softly. Aurora didn't look up immediately. "Take a seat anywhere. I'll be right with you," she called out, wringing out her rag. "I prefer the corner booth." The voice, low, gravelly, and commanding, sent a jolt of electricity straight down her spine. The rag slipped from her hands, hitting the floor with a wet slap. She looked up. Vittorio Gallo stood just inside the doorway. He wasn't wearing a bespoke tuxedo or a menacing charcoal suit. He wore a simple dark sweater and jeans. He looked older, perhaps a bit more tired, but the dangerous magnetic aura remained. He stood in the neon pink light of the diner, looking entirely out of place, yet exactly where he belonged. He walked toward her, stopping at the counter. He didn't sit in the booth. "What are you doing here?" Aurora breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs. Vittorio looked at her, his dark eyes intense, searching her face with the same desperate relief she had seen the night of the fire. "I tried," he said simply, his voice rough. "I tried to let you go. I tried to focus on the business, on the power. But the penthouse is empty, Aurora. The empire is loud, but it means nothing." He leaned against the counter, closing the distance between them. "You said you didn't want to live in a cage. You said my world would consume you." "It would have," she replied softly, her voice trembling. "I know," he agreed, shocking her. "Which is why I'm not asking you to come back to it." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick manila envelope, setting it gently on the counter between them. "What is this?" she asked, eyeing it suspiciously. "Deeds. Contracts," Vittorio explained, his voice remarkably calm. "I have restructured the family. Matteo is taking over the day-to-day operations of the syndicate. I am stepping back. I will retain an advisory role, but I am removing myself from the streets. I am taking the legitimate businesses, the shipping companies, the real estate, and I am leaving the darkness to others. Aurora stared at him, her mind struggling to process what he was saying. A Mafia boss didn't just step back. It was unheard of. It was dangerous. "You gave up your power?" she asked, incredulous. I realized that absolute power requires absolute isolation, he said, reaching across the counter to gently take her hand. His touch was warm, solid. And I don't want to be isolated anymore. I don't want to be the invisible king. I want to be a man. He looked around the slightly run-down diner, a faint, genuine smile touching his lips. "I bought a house in a quiet neighborhood. It has a garden. It needs work, but it's safe. It's not a fortress." He looked back at her, his eyes filled with a raw, terrifying hope. "I am stepping into your world, Aurora. If you will have me." Aurora looked at the man before her. He had systematically dismantled his own life, his own empire, to meet her on her terms. He wasn't demanding she submit to his darkness. He had fought his way out of it to stand in her light. Tears, sudden and overwhelming, prickled in her eyes. She gripped his hand tightly, feeling the rough calluses that told the story of his violent past and the steady pulse that promised a different future. "You're going to hate the diner coffee," she whispered, a watery smile breaking across her face. Vittorio chuckled, a deep, resonant sound that filled the quiet space. He stepped around the counter, pulling her into a fierce, encompassing embrace. "I will endure it," he murmured into her hair, "as long as you pour it." As they stood there in the neon-lit diner, the rain washing the city streets outside, the invisible king and the ordinary waitress finally found their sanctuary. They had navigated betrayal, war, and the terrifying chasm of their own differences, discovering that the most profound strength wasn't found in ruling an empire, but in the courage to surrender to love. Thank you for listening to this story. If you enjoyed following Vittorio and Aurora's journey from the shadows to the light, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a comment below. Your support allows me to continue creating new, emotional stories for you every week. Until next time.